7-month-old Emanuel Haro should have been spending his days wrapped in the simple joys of infancy, soft giggles that light up a room, lullabies sung gently by his mother, and the warmth of arms that promise safety. At that age, a child knows only the comfort of touch, the sparkle of light, the soothing rhythm of familiar voices. Emanuel should have been one of those children whose entire world revolved around naps, feeding times, and smiles bright enough to soften even the hardest of hearts. Yet, instead of being remembered for those precious moments, his name became something else entirely. Not a symbol of innocence and love, but a headline. A child whose first year was overshadowed by fear, suspicion, and tragedy. It all began on a quiet California morning in San Bernardino. The sun had barely risen, casting a faint golden glow across empty parking lots and quiet suburban streets. It was the kind of morning where life usually moved gently, where the air felt still, unbroken by chaos. But for Emanuel, this morning would forever mark the end of his innocence. The life of a baby, so fragile and new, was about to be thrust into a storm of police sirens, flashing lights, and unanswered questions. Rebecca Haro, his mother, made the call that would set this story into motion. At just after dawn, her frantic voice pierced the calm of the San Bernardino dispatch center. Breathless, shaken, her words stumbled out in panic. Her baby was gone. She claimed she had only stepped away briefly, running what she called a quick errand, leaving her infant inside the car. And when she returned, Emanuel was no longer there. Her voice cracked through the phone line, the raw sound of a mother's worst nightmare spilling into the ears of dispatchers trained to hear tragedy. Within minutes, police patrol cars roared into the lot where she had been parked. Their flashing red and blue lights cast long streaks of color against the pale morning, painting a scene no parent ever hopes to witness. Officers stepped out into a tense silence, their radios buzzing with chatter, but the weight of the moment heavy enough to mute even the static. A baby was missing. And in those first few minutes, when time is everything, the officers treated it with the gravest urgency. An abduction feared. The area was immediately cordoned off. Yellow police tape fluttered faintly in the breeze as officers began searching the lot, scanning every corner for clues. A dropped blanket, an abandoned pacifier, any sign of the child. Detectives pressed Rebecca with questions, their urgency sharp, their voices edged with suspicion but wrapped in the need for speed. Car. Which spot? How long was she gone? Did anyone see anything? Her answers, scattered by panic, painted a vague picture. She had only been gone for a few minutes, just a quick run inside. But to police, even a few minutes was more than enough time for a predator to strike. Every second mattered. Statistically, the first hours after a reported child abduction are the most crucial. If Emanuel had been taken, officers knew they were racing against time. They alerted nearby patrols, issued radio calls, and notified neighboring jurisdictions. The description of a baby, just 7 months old, small, defenseless, was broadcast through the county. Officers canvassed the area, knocking on car windows, questioning early morning passers-by, and checking surveillance cameras from surrounding businesses. Yet the silence remained, and with it, the crushing dread that had already settled over the scene. The parking lot itself told little. No broken glass, no signs of forced entry, no tire marks suggesting a quick getaway. To investigators, it was both frustrating and terrifying. A clean scene meant fewer leads. For a child this young, even the smallest clue could be the difference between hope and despair. But Emanuel had vanished as if into thin air. By mid-morning, the case had already drawn attention from the wider community. Word of a missing baby spread like wildfire, first through local radio stations and then across social media. Parents clutched their own children a little tighter, imagining how quickly safety could dissolve. Neighbors gathered near the scene, whispering fears, their eyes fixed on the flashing lights that had turned an ordinary lot into the center of a nightmare. For many, the thought was unbearable. What kind of person could take a 7-month-old child? Inside the cordon, detectives continued pressing for answers. Rebecca's story was simple but thin. She said she had left Emanuel in his car seat, locked inside the vehicle, while she ran a short errand. When she came back, he was gone. But as officers listened, They couldn't help but measure her words against the silence of the scene. How had no one noticed? Why were there no signs of struggle? And why had she risked leaving her baby alone at all? These questions, unspoken but heavy, lingered in the minds of the officers as they worked. Even as suspicion quietly grew, the priority remained the same: finding Emanuel. Search teams spread out from the lot, sweeping alleys, dumpsters, and backyards in widening circles. K-9 units were brought in, their handlers guiding them around the car and out into the streets, hoping for a trace of scent. But the dogs, too, found little to follow. Emanuel's trail seemed to vanish before it even began. For investigators, the dread was now twofold. If this was an abduction, the chances of recovering a child alive diminished with every passing hour. And if it was not an abduction, if something else had happened, then the truth might lie closer to home than anyone wanted to admit. That morning, as the sun climbed higher and the parking lot filled with reporters, the story of Emmanuel Haro shifted from a mother's frantic call to a community-wide fear. A baby was missing in San Bernardino. His name, Emanuel, meaning God with us, suddenly carried a haunting weight. And yet, on that quiet morning turned chaotic, it seemed God was far away, as silence and suspicion swallowed what should have been the laughter of an infant. The town came alive with urgency, a surge of humanity awakened by the haunting reality of a missing child. In neighborhoods across San Bernardino, word spread like fire, first through hushed phone calls and texts, then louder through television broadcasts and social media alerts. Within hours, the city was no longer simply a backdrop to a family's tragedy. It became the stage for a collective response. Strangers became family overnight, bonded by the primal instinct to protect a child. Emanuel's picture, his small face framed with chubby cheeks, eyes too young to comprehend the storm around him, was printed, copied, and taped to storefronts, streetlights, and car windows. Volunteers who had never spoken to the Haros before now walked the same streets with purpose, searching for clues, calling his name, and handing out flyers as if each paper carried not just information, but a plea to the universe: bring him home. Prayer circles formed in church parking lots. Pastors, priests, and community leaders gathered their congregations, urging compassion and hope. At candlelight vigils, flames flickered in the night breeze, fragile symbols of belief that light might break through the darkness swallowing the Haro family. Children clasped their parents' hands a little tighter, mothers held their babies closer, and fathers silently scanned the crowd, their protective instincts sharpening. Yet beneath the community's outward display of solidarity lay a deepening fear. Every hour without Emanuel, every search that ended empty-handed, widened the ache in people's chests. But while the streets filled with searchers and the voices of the community echoed with prayers, investigators were charting a different course. Their duty required them to sift not only through the open spaces where Emanuel might have been taken, but also through the tangled web of truth and lies that sometimes sits within a family's walls. For as devastating as an abduction might be, experience had taught law enforcement one painful reality. When a child disappears, the answers are often found not in the shadows of strangers, but in the lives of those closest to the child. Almost immediately, inconsistencies began to surface. Rebecca's initial timeline, the one she had so urgently relayed during that frantic 911 call, began to shift under the weight of police questioning. At first, she insisted she had only been gone a couple of minutes. But when pressed, those minutes stretched. What was once just a quick errand turned into 10 minutes, then possibly longer. Investigators noticed the cracks forming in her story, small but significant. They understood that in cases like this, precision matters. Every second counts, and the inability to account for them often means more than a slip of memory. Then there was Jake. While Rebecca spoke with urgency, repeating her version of events, her husband stood apart, silent, withdrawn. He was present at the scene but emotionally absent, his posture stiff, his answers short, his demeanor more of a shadow than a grieving father. Officers watched him carefully, noting his reluctance to engage, his refusal to meet their eyes. In the swirl of chaos, search dogs barking, radios buzzing, neighbors asking what they could do, Jake seemed untouched by the panic, as though retreating into himself. To the public, These details were invisible. On the outside, the Haros were the grieving parents, desperately hoping for the safe return of their baby. Rebecca appeared before cameras, her voice shaking, her eyes red-rimmed from tears. She pleaded for Emanuel's return, her words echoing the familiar cadence of parents who had suffered similar tragedies before her. But behind the scenes, investigators were dissecting every word, every gesture. The question no one wanted to ask aloud began to grow louder within police circles. Were the Haros themselves hiding something? The transformation of the investigation was subtle at first. Officers still combed through fields, alleys, and vacant lots. Volunteers still knocked on doors, asking if anyone had seen a stranger near the Haro vehicle. Yet, little by little, the focus turned inward. Detectives requested phone records, scrutinized surveillance footage, and mapped out the Haros movements in the days leading up to Emanuel's disappearance. They studied Rebecca's past, Jake's history, the dynamics of their relationship, and the stability, or instability, of their home life. The deeper they looked, the more troubling the picture became. Rebecca's shifting timeline was not her only inconsistency. Her explanations about why she had left Emanuel in the car at all began to unravel. She insisted she had locked the doors, but there was no clear sign of forced entry. She claimed she had been gone only briefly, yet store employees and nearby witnesses reported not seeing her at all during the time she described. The contradictions mounted, each one pulling investigators further from the theory of a sudden, random abduction and closer toward a darker, more intimate possibility. Jake's silence spoke volumes in its own way. Where most fathers in similar situations had erupted with fury, demanding action, and begging for their child's safe return, Jake remained strangely composed. Too composed, some said. When questioned directly, his responses were clipped and unemotional, as though he were reciting lines rehearsed in his head. Detectives who had spent years studying human behavior could not ignore it. Grief, panic, even rage were normal in such circumstances. But detachment often meant something else. The community, still hopeful and driven by compassion, remained unaware of the investigators' suspicions. To them, the Haros were victims, a family broken by tragedy. They handed out flyers with Emanuel's smiling face, organized meal trains for the parents, and offered words of comfort at vigils. But within the San Bernardino Police Department, the investigation had already shifted gears. The hunt for an unknown abductor was no longer the sole priority. The question had become far more unsettling. Could the very people begging for Emanuel's return be the ones responsible for his disappearance? The more detectives pressed, the more the answers slipped. Rebecca's recollection of events began to sound rehearsed, lacking the raw chaos of a mother's panicked memory. Jake's silence deepened into something colder, a wall investigators could not yet penetrate. And as the days stretched into nights, the case of a missing infant, once framed as a community's shared nightmare, was slowly, inexorably reshaped into something else, a case about the family itself. In the growing divide between public compassion and private suspicion, Emanuel's name hung like a question mark. He was the child everyone wanted to save, but he was also the child whose disappearance seemed to unravel every layer of the life he had been born into. What began as a desperate search for an abductor was transforming into an investigation that asked an even more disturbing question. What happens when danger doesn't come from the outside world, but from within the very walls meant to keep a baby safe? The Haro home, once thought of as the quiet center of family life, was transformed into something far different the moment investigators crossed its threshold. No longer was it a place filled with warmth, the soft hum of a television in the background, or the scattered sounds of a baby's laughter. It was now treated as a potential crime scene, every surface a possible clue, every object a silent witness to what might have happened to little Emanuel. Police officers and forensic technicians moved carefully through the rooms, documenting everything with photographs, notes, and evidence bags. What to an ordinary visitor might have looked like nothing more than a modest family home was, to trained investigators, a layered puzzle waiting to be pulled apart. They examined the crib first. The sheets, once meant to cradle Emanuel in safety, were lifted, bagged, and stored. Forensic teams checked for stains invisible to the naked eye, for hair, fibers, or fluids that might tell a story words could not. Bottles on the counter were catalogued, their contents tested, their placement noted. Was this how a mother of a 7-month-old would leave things if she had just stepped out for a moment? Toys scattered across the floor were handled with gloves, not just as playthings, but as objects that might hold fingerprints or traces of what had unfolded. Every detail, no matter how mundane, was treated as if it could hold the answer to Emanuel's disappearance. But the investigators weren't just searching for a child. They were searching for truth. And the truth, in their experience, often hid in contradictions. It wasn't always about finding something extraordinary. Sometimes it was about the things that didn't fit, the details that clashed with the stories told. Inside the Haro home, those inconsistencies began to emerge quickly. One of the first troubling discoveries was a baby blanket. Soft, pink, and folded in a way that seemed unnatural given the frantic state Rebecca had described when she called 911. Rebecca had told investigators she had wrapped Emanuel in a different blanket, one she insisted was blue, when she left him in the car that morning. Yet here was a pink blanket, its presence raising quiet but heavy questions. Was Rebecca mistaken? Had she lied? Or had something far more sinister taken place between the time of her call and the officer's arrival? As detectives continued their work, more small but significant details began to clash with Rebecca's account. In her statement, she emphasized panic, chaos, a frantic search for her baby. But the house itself, though cluttered in some corners, did not reflect the kind of disorder one might expect from a parent desperately looking for their child. Toys were positioned almost too neatly in certain areas, laundry folded in one pile but left untouched in another. Investigators noted the eerie calm of the setting, as though parts of the home had been deliberately arranged. The kitchen counter revealed more contradictions. Rebecca had claimed that she fed Emanuel just before leaving him in the car. Yet the bottles lined up on the counter seemed untouched. Their formula measured but not mixed, nipples capped but dry. Forensics later confirmed that some bottles held formula prepared hours earlier, spoiled and unfit for feeding, while others hadn't been used at all. If Emanuel had indeed been fed that morning, as Rebecca insisted, then why did the evidence suggest otherwise? Attention then shifted to Emanuel's nursery. The walls, decorated with the faint pastels typical of an infant's room, now seemed to mock the investigators with their innocence. A stuffed animal rested in the crib, perfectly placed. Yet beneath the crib sheet, a faint stain caught the forensic team's eye. It was small, nearly invisible, but under luminol it flared up in haunting confirmation. It was blood. Whose blood it was would require lab analysis. But in the mind of every officer in the room, the discovery cast a long, dark shadow over the story Rebecca had told. Outside the nursery, more signs stood out. In the living room, a pile of laundry was partially sorted, but one baby outfit, tiny, soft, and unmistakably Emanuel's, was crumpled near the bottom. Unlike the other clothes, this one was stained. Again, forensics would later determine the exact composition of the stain, but its presence in the Haro home on the very day their baby was reported missing was enough to deepen suspicion. The contradictions multiplied with every step. Investigators recalled Rebecca's words in the 911 call. She had returned to the car to find Emanuel gone, his car seat empty. But when they searched the house, they found the car seat itself tucked into a corner of the garage. Not in the vehicle, not outside, but placed in a spot that suggested forethought. How could a baby seat be there if Emanuel had last been seen in it that morning? Each detail, each inconsistency, chipped away at the story the Haros had crafted. To law enforcement, it was no longer just about the possibility of a stranger snatching a baby in broad daylight. It was about whether the very people crying for Emanuel's safe return might have already known he would never come back. The mood inside the home shifted as the hours went on. What began as cautious optimism that they might find some clue pointing outward quickly transformed into grim suspicion that the answers lay much closer than anyone wanted to admit. Officers exchanged quiet looks, their faces drawn with the weight of realization. What they were piecing together was not just a missing persons case, it was becoming something darker. Something that hinted at deception, betrayal, and perhaps even violence. And yet, Through it all, Rebecca continued to insist on her version of events. She repeated the same details to detectives, her tone wavering but her words unmoved. Jake, meanwhile, remained mostly silent, standing in corners, avoiding eye contact, his arms crossed as if shielding himself from the mounting scrutiny. To the outside world, they were grieving parents. But to the investigators carefully cataloging every inch of their home, they were potential suspects in the disappearance and possibly the death of their child. The Haro home was no longer just a place where a family once lived. It had become a map of contradictions, a silent story told in blankets, bottles, and stains. And the story it whispered to those who listened closely was far darker than the one Rebecca had shared with dispatch in her frantic call. The truth was beginning to emerge, and with it, the chilling realization that this was never simply a missing persons case. It was the unraveling of something much more sinister. In separate rooms, Rebecca and Jake were placed under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, each facing a table that suddenly felt more like a barrier than a surface. Detectives settled in across from them, their notepads open, recorders clicking on. The atmosphere was heavy, suffocating even, with the weight of what had already been uncovered back at their home. For the investigators, this was no longer just routine questioning. It was the critical moment when inconsistencies could unravel, when hidden truths might slip free under the pressure of repetition and time. Rebecca sat hunched, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. At first, her voice carried the tremor of panic, her words tumbling out with the urgency of a mother desperate to find her baby. But as the hours stretched on, her story began to shift. What had initially been a clear, linear account of the morning suddenly became blurred, details slipping like sand through fingers. Detectives pressed her. What time exactly did you leave the car? How long were you inside? Did anyone see you? Each time, her answers wavered. In one version, she claimed she had been gone only 3 minutes. In another, closer to 10. Then, pressed further, she admitted it could have been longer. These weren't small inconsistencies, they were gaping holes in the foundation of her story. And every time she adjusted her answer, the detectives noted it down, the weight of suspicion growing heavier. Her description of Emanuel's blanket, too, shifted. She swore he had been wrapped in blue. When detectives confronted her with the pink blanket found in the house, she stuttered, faltered, then tried to explain it away. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe I grabbed the wrong one. But investigators knew mothers rarely made mistakes about such things, especially not when it came to something so deeply personal as what their child was wrapped in on the morning he disappeared. Meanwhile, in another room, Jake was the opposite of his wife. If Rebecca's story was fluid and ever-changing, Jake's was a wall of silence. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes fixed downward. At times he refused to answer at all, staring past the detectives as if the questions were smoke he could simply ignore until it vanished. When he did respond, his words were clipped, devoid of emotion, almost rehearsed. I don't know. I don't remember. Ask Rebecca. The contrast between the two was startling. One shifting, one stonewalling. To detectives seasoned in interrogation, it was a red flag. Silence can speak as loudly as contradiction, and Jake's lack of engagement screamed avoidance. The more they pressed him, the further he seemed to retreat, as though withholding even the smallest details was a shield against something larger he did not want to reveal. For investigators, the questions grew darker. Were Rebecca and Jake simply traumatized parents, their memories scrambled and emotions blocking their ability to communicate? Or were they intentionally weaving a web of confusion, each playing a different role? One distracted and inconsistent, the other cold and impenetrable? Every new detail only deepened the chasm between what the Haros claimed and what the evidence suggested. For one, there was no sign of forced entry into the car. No shattered glass, no damaged locks, no fingerprints belonging to an unknown intruder. If someone had snatched Emanuel, they had done so with surgical precision, leaving behind not a single trace. And yet, even that explanation seemed too far-fetched. Detectives also combed through nearby businesses and homes with surveillance cameras. In modern investigations, these cameras often provide the breakthrough moments. The grainy image of a suspicious car circling, a figure walking too close, a movement in the shadows. But in Emanuel's case, there was nothing. No footage of a kidnapper approaching the vehicle, no figure carrying a baby away, no mysterious van pulling out of the lot at the time Rebecca described. The cameras showed cars moving, people going about their morning routines, but nothing that lined up with an abduction. It was as though Emanuel had simply evaporated from existence. And that silence, the absence of evidence, echoed back to the Haros themselves. In so many child abduction cases, there are at least fragments of a trail, witnesses who recall a stranger, a neighbor who saw something unusual, or a bystander who noticed a car driving off too quickly. But here? Nothing. Not one person could corroborate Rebecca's story. Not one witness could place Emanuel in that car on the morning he was reported missing. Detectives felt the chill of that realization. When the world around a crime offers no answers, often the answers lie within the home. And the Haros, sitting separately in their interrogation rooms, were each unraveling in their own way. Rebecca, with her shifting story, seemed to be struggling to keep her narrative aligned with the evidence investigators had already collected. Jake, with his hollow silence, seemed to be protecting something, or someone, by saying nothing at all. The hours dragged on, and the detectives grew sharper in their questioning. They circled back again and again to the same details, testing for consistency, watching for slips. They asked Rebecca why she had left Emanuel alone in the car at all, something most parents would never dream of. Her answers shifted between justification and apology. "It was only for a minute," she said at one point, then later, "I didn't think it was dangerous." Each explanation only raised more suspicion. With Jake, they shifted tactics, hoping to provoke a reaction. They mentioned the inconsistencies in Rebecca's story, hoping he would challenge them or correct her. Instead, he sat still, unmoved, repeating his wall of short answers. To detectives, it was as if the couple had rehearsed two roles. One meant to distract, the other meant to withhold. And yet, neither seemed to grasp how much their behavior was betraying them. For in the silence of the interrogation rooms, in the shifting details and the stubborn refusal to speak, detectives began to piece together the uncomfortable truth. The abduction theory was collapsing. The story of Emanuel being taken by a stranger was losing credibility with every passing hour. Instead, suspicion pooled where no one in the community wanted it to go, squarely at the feet of his parents. Investigators soon uncovered a chilling piece of the puzzle, one that cast a long, unforgiving shadow over the entire case. Beneath the surface of the Haro family's tragedy lay a past already stained by violence and neglect. Records revealed that in 2023, just a year before Emanuel's disappearance, Jake Haro had stood before a judge convicted of child cruelty. His victim was not a stranger, not someone far removed from his home, but his own daughter from a previous marriage. The details of that case were grim. The girl, once full of life, had suffered repeated abuse at the hands of her father. The injuries she endured were not just physical, but life-altering. The reports described bruises, neglect, and episodes of cruelty so severe that the child's development was permanently damaged. By the time authorities intervened, the abuse had left her bedridden, trapped in a body that could no longer respond as it once had. Cerebral palsy, a condition born not from genetics or fate, but from prolonged cruelty, was her reality now. And yet, despite the severity of the crime, Jake never truly faced the weight of justice. The court system, citing factors like his work history and the possibility of rehabilitation, handed down a suspended prison sentence. Instead of serving time behind bars, Jake was given probation and ordered to complete 180 days of work release, essentially community service under structured supervision. In the eyes of the law, it was a second chance. In the eyes of prosecutors now revisiting the file, it was a catastrophic failure. That suspended sentence had allowed Jake to walk free, to return to his daily life as though the courtroom was nothing more than a temporary interruption. He had faced no lasting accountability, no punishment that matched the scale of his daughter's suffering. The justice system had turned away, placing its faith in rehabilitation rather than protection. And because of that leniency, Jake remained free to build a new family, free to father another child, Emanuel. Now, with Emanuel gone, investigators and prosecutors could not help but ask the damning question: Had the system's mercy cost this baby his life? The thought was unbearable, but it was also unavoidable. To those who studied the patterns of abuse, the connection was all too familiar. Violence rarely exists in isolation. A person who harms one child often poses a danger to others, particularly when accountability is absent. Jake's past was not just a red flag, it was a glaring warning siren that had been ignored. And Emanuel, only 7 months old, might have been the silent victim of that oversight. For prosecutors, the anger was personal. The very office that had once negotiated or accepted Jake's leniency now found itself staring at the consequences of that decision. The files told a damning story. In 2023, they had argued for accountability but allowed the outcome to stand. In 2024, another child was missing, perhaps dead. And at the center of both cases stood the same man. The community, once shielded from Jake's past, began to hear whispers of it through media leaks and investigative reports. Outrage grew quickly. Parents who had joined the search for Emanuel felt betrayed, realizing that the man at the center of the case had already been marked as dangerous. They asked why they hadn't known sooner, why someone with such a history was allowed to raise another child without scrutiny or intervention. For Emanuel's case, the revelation shifted the tone dramatically. This was no longer simply the story of a baby gone missing. It was a story about systems failing, about overlooked violence repeating itself. The Haro home was no longer viewed through the lens of sympathy alone. It became a symbol of warning ignored. The questions swelled with each news cycle. Why had the judge believed Jake deserved leniency? Why had probation officers not intervened more aggressively when red flags surfaced? Why had Child Protective Services not placed Emanuel under closer watch, knowing his father's history? These were not just questions about Emanuel, they were questions about the gaps that allowed danger to fester until it claimed another innocent life. The tragedy reopened wounds far beyond the Haro family. Advocates for child protection spoke out, pointing to Emanuel's disappearance as proof of how dangerous leniency can be. Suspended sentences and probation, they argued, may save a system money, but they can cost children their lives. Emanuel was the embodiment of that cost. A baby whose laughter had been silenced, not only by the people who should have protected him, but by the structures that had once looked the other way. As investigators pieced together the chain of events, the theme was undeniable. Justice had failed one child, and in doing so, had doomed another. Emanuel's case became a mirror reflecting the uncomfortable truth about overlooked violence. It showed how abuse, when minimized or dismissed, doesn't simply disappear. It festers. It grows. And eventually, it demands another victim. For the detectives now knee-deep in the investigation, this discovery hardened their resolve. They were no longer just chasing the truth about one disappearance. They were pursuing accountability for a system that had failed twice. Emanuel's small body was missing, but his story carried the weight of a warning that could not be ignored. And for the public, the revelation was a gut punch. Emanuel's disappearance was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a chain, a continuation of violence that had been allowed to persist. The people entrusted with protecting children had chosen leniency over justice, and the cost was a life that had barely begun. The silence surrounding Emanuel's fate now carried a new kind of echo, not just the questions of where he was, but the haunting realization of how many warnings had been ignored. The past had been prologue, and the future had been stolen. Rebecca's role in Emanuel's disappearance became the heaviest cloud hanging over the investigation, and the deeper police dug, the more her silence seemed to expand into something unbearable. Was she an active participant in whatever happened to her child, or had she been trapped for years under the control of a man with a violent past? Investigators could not ignore the weight of her shifting stories. One day she spoke of running a quick errand, another day of leaving Emanuel safe in his crib, details changing like pages torn from a book and rearranged. And yet, it was not only her contradictions that haunted detectives, but the hollowness in her voice, the pauses too long, the tears that came too easily in some moments and not at all in others. Her silence between questions was deafening, and in many ways, it spoke louder than anything she said out loud. In the eyes of the community, this silence carried its own verdict. At first, Rebecca was seen as a heartbroken mother. Strangers rallied around her, setting up vigils, whispering prayers into the night, holding on to the belief that perhaps Emanuel had been taken but could still be found alive. But as police grew colder in their public statements, no longer speaking of a kidnapper and instead focusing on those closest to Emanuel, suspicion turned outward and then back inward, directly at the Haros. Neighbors who once embraced Rebecca now avoided her gaze. The family's home, once filled with candles and flowers from supporters, soon became a house people crossed the street to avoid. Inside the police station, detectives wrestled with a dilemma. Was Rebecca another victim of Jake's long shadow, a woman beaten down, silenced, and manipulated into protecting him? Or had she chosen silence to protect herself? The distinction was razor thin, and the difference meant everything. One path suggested she was a mother who had lost control of her household, unable to stop the violence around her. The other painted her as a participant, a mother who stood by and allowed her child to vanish under circumstances she never fully explained. The pressure on Rebecca only grew as community anger boiled over. Rumors spread like wildfire, each story darker than the last. Whispers said Rebecca knew more than she admitted. Some said she had hidden the baby herself. Others insisted Jake alone was responsible and that Rebecca was too afraid to speak. Whichever version people chose to believe, the result was the same. The family who had once been embraced was now shunned. Vigils that had once been filled with candlelight grew emptier. Volunteers who had searched the desert trails, parks, and abandoned lots slowly drifted away, muttering about lies and betrayals. Social media pages created to find Baby Emmanuel turned into platforms for outrage, with comment after comment demanding justice, pointing fingers directly at the parents. It was a complete reversal. The family's tragedy had become the community's fury. Detectives understood the stakes. Public trust was unraveling. If they didn't act, if they didn't uncover the truth soon, the case risked being consumed entirely by speculation and outrage. Rebecca, meanwhile, was caught between two crushing forces, the law pressing in from one side and the community pressing in from the other. Each time she was questioned, each time her answers shifted, investigators were left wondering not just what she knew, but why she was holding back. Was it fear of Jake? Was it guilt for her own role? Or was it the knowledge that the truth, once spoken, could never be taken back? The Haros world collapsed, brick by brick, under the weight of suspicion. What had begun as a frantic search for a missing infant turned into a hunt for accountability. The very people who once tied ribbons to trees, who once whispered prayers for Emanuel's safe return, now whispered a different prayer, that justice, long denied, would finally be done. And yet, in the silence of Emanuel's absence, one question grew louder than all others. Did Rebecca lose her child, or did she give him up to a fate darker than anyone could have imagined? Science became the quiet but unflinching witness, a force immune to persuasion, manipulation, or half-truths. In the Haro investigation, the forensics unit moved methodically, treating the family home not as a place of comfort, but as a living archive of secrets waiting to be unearthed. Every item told a potential story. Walls were scanned with specialized lights, floors were dusted for prints, and baby bottles were sealed in evidence bags. Investigators knew that in cases where words failed and emotions clouded judgment, science often whispered the truth that people tried to bury. Technicians moved slowly through the nursery, the supposed sanctuary where Emanuel should have been safe. They carefully removed crib sheets and examined them under ultraviolet light, searching for traces invisible to the human eye, tiny fibers, microscopic stains, or skin cells that could hint at what really happened. A baby's life is usually marked by innocence, but here, every object in the room was treated as a potential clue in a crime. Even the soft toys that once promised comfort were packaged into sterile bags, destined for laboratory tests that could reveal evidence of violence or neglect. Among these items, one detail refused to fade into the background: the pink baby blanket. From the start, its presence puzzled investigators. Rebecca's initial statements didn't account for it, and her shifting story only made it stand out more. The blanket didn't belong where it was found, and its placement contradicted her desperate 911 call. It was a simple object, ordinary to the naked eye, but in the hands of forensic scientists, it became a key capable of unlocking hidden truths. Tests on the blanket began with the basics. Fibers were collected, cross-referenced, and analyzed. But soon, more advanced examinations revealed troubling inconsistencies. Stains that appeared faint under regular light blazed under chemical sprays, telling a story that Rebecca's words never did. Trace materials suggested that the blanket had been moved, possibly staged, and that it didn't fit the narrative she tried to present to authorities. Inconsistencies began to form patterns, and those patterns began to form suspicion. The blanket was swabbed for DNA, and the results rattled the investigators. Certain traces matched Emanuel, as expected, but there were other elements that didn't add up. Hints of mishandling, indications that the blanket may have been used to cover something more sinister than a sleeping child. The results didn't immediately scream guilt, but they opened the door to chilling possibilities. Why had Rebecca mentioned some items in her account while conveniently omitting this one? Why had the blanket shown up in a place that contradicted her timeline? Forensic science also dug deeper than just physical evidence. It painted pictures of behavior. Analysts considered whether the placement of the blanket suggested panic, staging, or concealment. A staged scene often carries telltale signs: objects too neatly arranged, items out of context, or evidence that contradicts natural human behavior in moments of crisis. The pink blanket, in its quiet presence, raised exactly those red flags. The crime lab's findings breathed new life into the investigation, shifting it firmly from the realm of possibility into the foundation of a potential prosecution. Detectives no longer relied solely on shifting testimonies or speculation. They now had tangible evidence that suggested deceit. In court, science speaks with authority, and here, it was preparing to speak volumes. This single piece of cloth became more than fabric. It became a narrative thread, unraveling the carefully woven story Rebecca and Jake had tried to present. It transformed the investigation from a desperate search into a case of accountability. And as each forensic detail emerged, the once unthinkable began to look undeniable: that Emanuel's disappearance wasn't the work of a shadowy stranger, but something orchestrated, concealed, and devastatingly close to home. The pink blanket didn't just sit in an evidence locker. It hovered like a ghost over every conversation, every interrogation, every report. To investigators, it became symbolic, proof that no matter how carefully a lie is told, science will find the cracks. Detectives turned to the cameras. Surveillance became their silent witness, an unblinking eye that saw everything and forgot nothing. They pulled hours of footage from gas stations, convenience stores, traffic lights, and businesses near the Haro home and the parking lot where Rebecca claimed Emanuel vanished. Each frame was slowed, rewound, paused, studied. Officers scrutinized headlights in the distance, shadows moving between buildings, and even the smallest changes in the background. And yet, despite the exhaustive search, one glaring detail stood out. There was no abductor. No hooded figure lurking in the shadows. No stranger sprinting away with a bundle in their arms. Nothing that resembled the nightmare Rebecca had described in her frantic 911 call. The parking lot where she said Emanuel was snatched appeared calm, uneventful, and empty. The only consistent presence in the footage was Rebecca herself, walking, waiting, fumbling with her phone, pacing with the air of someone rehearsing a performance rather than reacting to sudden terror. The revelation cut through the investigation like a knife. It wasn't just that the cameras failed to catch an abductor, it was that they revealed a void where her story should have fit. The timeline she gave detectives had cracks wide enough for suspicion to pour through. Every second captured on tape chipped away at the desperate picture of a kidnapped infant. Meanwhile, investigators began stitching together Rebecca's movements with the data from her phone. Call logs, text messages, even GPS pings filled in gaps the surveillance couldn't. Instead of proving her innocence, the digital trail exposed inconsistencies. Times didn't align. Her call to 911 came only after a long stretch unaccounted for, a stretch investigators now believed was crucial. The pieces were aligning, not outward toward the faceless predator the community had been told to fear, but inward, back to the Haro home and the couple themselves. The chilling question could no longer be avoided. Had Emanuel ever left that house alive? Detectives revisited the scene with renewed focus. The baby bottles drying by the sink, the half-folded laundry in the corner, the untouched crib with neatly arranged toys, it all spoke to a child who should have been there. Yet, beneath that surface of domestic normalcy, every detail screamed of absence. No neighbor recalled hearing Rebecca cry out when she allegedly discovered Emanuel gone. No passerby remembered seeing her in a panic. Even her supposed errand raised suspicion. What was she really doing in that lot? Investigators weighed the evidence carefully. The pink blanket, once brushed off as a harmless detail, now loomed like a silent accusation. It didn't match Rebecca's account. Forensic analysis uncovered biological traces, subtle, but enough to suggest that Emanuel's final moments may have unfolded far differently than she described. The fibers whispered a story his parents refused to tell. In police headquarters, detectives gathered late into the night, maps and photographs spread across the table. They retraced the narrative again and again, each time landing in the same place. The evidence refused to point to an outside threat. The community had been mobilized against a phantom, searching fields, scouring streets, posting Emanuel's face on every corner. But the cameras and the science spoke with clarity. There was no abductor. The grim possibility hardened into a chilling theory. Emanuel had not been taken. He had been lost, perhaps in anger, perhaps in neglect, long before Rebecca dialed 911. And if that theory was true, the Haro's carefully spun story was not a desperate plea for help but a calculated attempt at cover-up. The silence around Emanuel's disappearance grew heavier with each discovery. It wasn't just the absence of clues pointing to a kidnapper, it was the suffocating quiet of parents refusing to explain the unexplainable. Neighbors who had once joined candlelight vigils now avoided the Haro home, whispering in hushed voices that the answers everyone sought had been inside that house all along. Every new frame of footage, every fingerprint lifted, every fiber tested pulled the circle tighter. Emanuel's world, once filled with the promise of laughter and life, had been reduced to evidence tags and forensic reports. The investigation was no longer a hunt for a stranger. It had become something darker, a search for the truth buried within the very family that had sworn to protect him. The arrests hit like a thunderclap. Overnight, the Haros faces shifted from tear-streaked parents pleading on the evening news to mugshots plastered across headlines. The shift was jarring, almost surreal. For neighbors, it was as if the ground had been pulled out from under them. The couple they once passed in the grocery store, the family they saw at church, were suddenly recast as villains in the darkest of stories. The cries for Emanuel's safe return turned into furious demands for justice. Candlelight vigils became heated town hall meetings, where the community openly questioned how much had been hidden behind the walls of that modest home. Inside the county jail, the truth grew even more elusive. Jake clung to denial like a lifeline. His voice, flat and unyielding, carried no trace of sorrow when detectives pressed him about Emanuel's fate. He claimed innocence, insisting that law enforcement had twisted the narrative to frame him. But for investigators who had seen the fractured bones of his past convictions, his words rang hollow. They saw not a man wrongfully accused, but a repeat offender who had already left one child permanently scarred. Rebecca, however, was different. Where Jake projected control, Rebecca unraveled. Behind closed doors, tears streamed freely as she tried to weave together fragments of a story that never quite held. She sobbed about her baby, about the morning he disappeared, about being overwhelmed and terrified. Yet every time detectives circled back with hard evidence, the blanket, the shifting timelines, the lack of an intruder, her answers faltered. Her words wavered between pleas of innocence and subtle suggestions that Jake held more of the blame. This contrast between the two only deepened the mystery. Were they united in a terrible secret, or was Rebecca breaking under the weight of Jake's shadow? Prosecutors began preparing for the possibility that their cases would diverge, that one parent might turn on the other in exchange for a lighter sentence. Meanwhile, the most pressing question haunted every corner of the investigation: where was Emanuel? No grave had been found. No body had surfaced. Search teams combed the desert, rivers, and abandoned lots, but turned up nothing. Emanuel's absence remained the loudest evidence of all, a silence that prosecutors feared could weaken their case. A murder trial without a body is one of the steepest hills in the justice system. Still, law enforcement pressed forward. The arrest of both parents marked a turning point. What began as a desperate search for a missing child had hardened into a criminal case drenched in suspicion, betrayal, and shattered trust. Emanuel's name was no longer tied to the hope of rescue. It had become the centerpiece of a fight for justice. And as Jake and Rebecca sat in separate cells, the nation asked the same chilling question. If not them, then who? And if it was them, why couldn't they tell the world where Emanuel was? Outside the jailhouse, the air felt heavy, charged with a kind of grief that had curdled into anger. Reporters jostled for position, cameras flashing every time a new development spilled out of the courthouse doors. Neighbors who once brought casseroles and flowers now held signs, some painted hastily with markers, others carefully printed with Emanuel's smiling baby photo. The words that appeared most often, "Justice for Emanuel, no more lies, we want the truth," spoke volumes about the way the public's sympathy had hardened into rage. The Haros were no longer the grieving parents who had begged for Emanuel's safe return. They were suspects, accused of the most unthinkable betrayal. The transformation shocked many in the community, yet others claimed they saw it coming. Whispers about Rebecca's inconsistencies, Jake's violent past, and the shifting details of their stories had already poisoned public trust. And now, with both parents behind bars, that distrust bloomed into near certainty. To the court of public opinion, the Haros were already guilty, guilty beyond redemption, guilty beyond mercy. But inside the walls of the courthouse, reality was far more complicated. Prosecutors knew they faced one of the toughest legal battles imaginable. Building a murder case without a body was like trying to complete a puzzle without its centerpiece. They had compelling circumstantial evidence. The pink blanket with troubling forensic traces, the security footage that showed no abductor, the timeline that crumbled under scrutiny, and the history of abuse tied to Jake. All of these elements told a damning story. Yet without Emanuel's remains, there was no definitive proof of how, when, or even if he died. The defense wasted no time exploiting that gap. No body, no proof, became their mantra, repeated so often that it began to echo in the minds of jurors. They argued that prosecutors were not presenting facts, but constructing a narrative out of grief, speculation, and bias. They painted Rebecca as a broken mother, crushed by loss and confused by pressure. They portrayed Jake, despite his past, as a man unfairly shackled by assumptions. And they reminded everyone that the cornerstone of justice was reasonable doubt, something they insisted hovered over every unanswered question in this case. The jurors sat silently through it all, their faces unreadable. Yet one could only imagine the weight pressing down on them. In their hands lay the power to decide not only the Haros' fate, but Emanuel's legacy. Could they deliver justice for a child whose body had never been found? Could they convict based on evidence that spoke loudly but indirectly? Or would doubt tip the scales toward acquittal, leaving the mystery unsolved forever? Beyond the legal strategies and courtroom drama, one truth cut deeper than any argument. Emanuel was gone. His crib sat empty, his tiny clothes folded in drawers he would never open. Toys gathered dust, mocking the silence that filled the Haro home. The community, once filled with hope that Emanuel might be found alive, now struggled to accept that they might never know what really happened. Search efforts stretched far and wide. Teams combed through landfills, scoured deserts, and dredged drainage canals. Tips poured in by the hundreds, but every lead dissolved into nothing. Each failed search only deepened the ache of uncertainty. It wasn't just about guilt anymore. It was about answers. Where was Emanuel? What had been done to him? Why did no one step forward to explain? For many in the community, justice felt incomplete without the truth. They wanted closure, not just a conviction. They wanted Emanuel's body found, his final moments known, his story told with honesty. Yet there were others who felt differently. To them, securing a guilty verdict was enough. Convicting the Haros would stand as a declaration that Emanuel's life mattered, that the system recognized the crime even if the evidence of his body was missing. And so the case pressed forward, teetering on the fragile balance between evidence and absence, certainty and doubt. Every new revelation tightened the noose around the Haros, but every unanswered question gave the defense room to maneuver. It was a trial built not only on evidence, but on emotion, speculation, and the unbearable silence of a missing child. Yet through every hearing, every headline, and every anguished plea, the same haunting question lingered, cutting deeper than any courtroom speech. If Emanuel was gone, where was he now? Was he hidden in some shallow grave, lying forgotten in a landfill, or spirited away to a place investigators had yet to discover? And perhaps more chilling still, would the truth ever be known, or would Emanuel's story end not with justice, but with silence? The weight of that uncertainty pressed down on everyone involved. For the prosecutors, it was the battle of their careers. For the defense, it was a test of strategy and survival. For the community, it was a wound that refused to heal. And for Emanuel, whose voice could never be heard, the fight for truth and justice became the only legacy left behind. The courtroom became the final battleground, a place where truth, lies, and speculation collided in front of a restless audience that demanded answers. Prosecutors laid out their case with precision, painting a picture of a baby whose life had been stolen not by chance, not by a stranger lurking in the night, but by the very people sworn to protect him. Each exhibit was carefully introduced. Photographs of the disarrayed Haro home, the pink blanket whose fibers whispered of inconsistencies, the recorded interviews where Rebecca stumbled through timelines and Jake refused to cooperate. Every piece of evidence was a thread, and the prosecution worked tirelessly to weave them into a tapestry of guilt. But the defense struck back with equal force, hammering one undeniable truth: there was no body. No definitive forensic evidence that proved Emanuel was dead. Without remains, the defense argued, every theory was just that, a theory. They cast doubt on the reliability of the investigators, suggesting that law enforcement had tunnel vision, eager to pin the crime on the parents rather than entertain other possibilities. They suggested alternative scenarios, however far-fetched. Perhaps Emanuel had been abducted by an unknown party. Perhaps he had been taken by someone too skilled to leave a trace. The defense sought to implant just enough doubt in the minds of the jurors to fracture the narrative the prosecution had built. Witnesses took the stand, some with trembling voices and others with steely certainty. Neighbors recalled the Haros' strained relationship, the shouting that sometimes spilled into the night, the sight of Rebecca carrying Emanuel with a weariness that didn't resemble maternal love. Experts in child welfare testified about Jake's prior conviction for cruelty against his older daughter, reminding the court of the horrific legacy of abuse that trailed him. Prosecutors emphasized how the justice system had failed that little girl once, and warned the jury not to let it fail Emanuel now. Yet the defense countered with character witnesses who spoke of Rebecca as a loving mother, one who was overwhelmed but not malicious. They painted her as trapped in Jake's shadow, intimidated into silence, incapable of defying the man who dominated her life. For some jurors, Rebecca became a question mark. Was she a perpetrator, or was she another victim in a cycle of violence? That ambiguity hung in the air like smoke, clouding the path to certainty. Inside the courtroom, the clash was not only about Emanuel but about the very definition of justice. Could someone be convicted of murder when the victim's body was never found? How much weight should circumstantial evidence carry? Was suspicion enough, or did the law demand something tangible, something irrefutable? These were the questions jurors wrestled with as both sides fought to sway them. Outside the courthouse, the community grieved collectively, their sorrow not bound by legal technicalities. To them, Emanuel was already lost. Candles were lit at vigils, teddy bears were left at makeshift memorials, and prayers were whispered for a baby whose laughter would never again echo through the streets of San Bernardino County. The public didn't need a body to feel the weight of Emanuel's absence. It was etched in every parent's fear, every child's innocence, every neighbor's unease. In many ways, Emanuel became more than a missing child. He became a symbol of how the system bends under the weight of bureaucracy and leniency, how opportunities to protect children can be squandered by courts unwilling to impose meaningful consequences. His story reignited debates about child protection laws, about whether known abusers should ever be allowed near vulnerable children again. Advocacy groups rallied, demanding reform, demanding that Emanuel's name not fade into another statistic of preventable tragedy. The trial stretched on, each day a new chapter of anguish. Reporters filled the benches, their pens capturing every gasp, every objection, every tear shed by Rebecca as she sat just feet away from the man the prosecution painted as a monster. Jake remained stoic, his jaw clenched, eyes betraying little emotion. But jurors watched, and they noticed when Rebecca flinched at his presence, noticed when his anger flared during testimony, noticed the moments when silence said more than words ever could. And through it all, one haunting question loomed, echoing through the halls of justice and the hearts of the community. Where was Emanuel? Without that answer, every argument seemed incomplete, every theory unfulfilled. The absence of his body was not just a gap in the case. It was a wound that refused to close. For San Bernardino County, the case was not only about Emanuel's fate but about their own collective conscience. They grieved as though for one of their own because, in many ways, he was. Emanuel represented every vulnerable child whose cries go unheard, every warning sign ignored, every chance for intervention that comes too late. His story was not just about loss. It was about accountability, about the heavy price of turning away when danger is already at the door. And so, as the trial moved toward its conclusion, the people waited, not just for a verdict, but for justice that felt long overdue. Whether or not the law could provide it remained uncertain, but Emanuel had already left his mark. He had become a symbol of a system's failure, of justice delayed, and of innocence lost. Even within the Haro family, fractures deepened in ways that were both personal and irreparable. Relatives who once gathered for birthdays, barbecues, and holidays now found themselves split down the middle, speaking in whispers, exchanging accusations, and carrying unspoken grief. Some members clung to the belief that Rebecca was a victim of circumstance, manipulated, controlled, or silenced by Jake. They argued that she had been swept into his storm, too frightened to resist, too broken to speak truth. Others, however, demanded accountability, pointing out that her silence was not just passive but active, that she had stood beside Jake, maintained his story, and withheld the truth even when Emanuel's life was at stake. Family dinners turned into battlegrounds. Text chains dissolved into silence. Cousins, siblings, aunts, and uncles found themselves questioning who was truly at fault and whether loyalty could ever excuse complicity. The tragedy didn't just take Emanuel. It fractured the very roots of the family tree that should have nurtured him. A baby's laugh that once united generations instead became the echo that deepened their divide. The weight of unanswered questions hung over every gathering, every memory. When Emanuel's name was spoken, it was followed by uncomfortable silence or heated debate, a reminder that the family had not only lost a child but also the trust and unity that had once defined them. The Haros weren't just a family anymore. They had become a case study in how tragedy can shred the fabric of kinship. As the years rolled forward, the case lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. Emanuel's face remained frozen in photographs, forever 7 months old, forever innocent. Time moved on for the world, but for those closest to the case, it stood still. Every birthday Emanuel never celebrated was marked with grief. Every milestone, his first steps, his first words, his first day at school, existed only in imagination, cruel reminders of what had been stolen. The evidence, though compelling, never fully tied the story together. It pointed inward, back toward the Haro home, but it never gave the closure the public demanded. Without Emanuel's remains, without the undeniable truth of what happened in his final moments, the case remained in limbo, a puzzle with its most important piece missing. Prosecutors carried the burden of proof. Detectives carried the frustration of leads that led only to dead ends. And the community carried the unbearable weight of uncertainty. For Emanuel Haro, justice remains a story half-written. The chapters that should have revealed the truth remain unwritten, suspended in silence, leaving everyone to wrestle with what they believe and what they fear. Was he failed by a justice system that had already given Jake a second chance he did not deserve? Was Rebecca powerless, or was she complicit? Did the walls of the Haro home hold answers that will never be spoken? These questions remain, unresolved and heavy, hanging in the air like storm clouds that never break. And yet, despite the silence, Emanuel is not forgotten. In San Bernardino County and beyond, his memory lives on in vigils where candles burn softly against the night, each flame a small act of defiance against the darkness of what happened to him. For every unanswered question, there is a whispered prayer. For every doubt, there is a memory of his small, innocent face. For those who still gather to remember him, Emanuel is more than a missing child. He is a reminder of the fragility of innocence, of the cost of leniency, and of the responsibility that society holds in protecting its most vulnerable. The silence left in his absence speaks louder than any verdict ever could. It echoes through the halls of justice, through the broken ties of family, and through the hearts of those who still demand to know what became of him. It is a silence that accuses, a silence that mourns, and a silence that refuses to let the world forget. Because at the heart of it all, one truth remains unshakable: a baby vanished. And until the day that truth is spoken aloud, the story of Emanuel Haro will remain not just a case, but a wound that time cannot heal, and that silence can never close.